On this episode of Up Close and Personal, join me, Joanie Sutter, as we focus our attention on the story of a young boy who for most of his childhood was ill, but used art and imagination to work with some of Hollywood's great movie legends. Over 50 years in the making, Cortlandt Hull and the Witch's Dungeon have been commissioned by Universal Studios, the U.S. Postal Service, the Connecticut Department of Tourism, and continue to travel to major film conventions across the country. So let's get up close and personal with Cortlandt Hull. So let's go back to the early 1960s. Bristol, Connecticut. A young boy used art and imagination as a way to deal with a rare illness. Can you tell us about that time?
Well, I had a rare blood condition, which is commonly called the kid in the plastic bubble. And what it really boils down to is that I would get a virus and then it kept repeating in my system. And because of this, I had to be eventually home tutored because I couldn't make up all the work. So I developed an interest in art and film, and it was my outlet that I was able to be creative.
Louis Gagnon, affectionately known as Cortlandt's Uncle Louie, was a spring maker by vocation and a model-making hobbyist along with all things electrical. He was a big model train aficionado, and some trains he built from scratch. It was dear Uncle Louie who helped him with the building and painting of model kits and was instrumental in later years for engineering the electronics for the elaborate displays.
Uncle Louie was a wonderful model builder. He primarily built model trains, and he could machine them right from scratch, out of copper, and he did amazing work. Well, anyway, he knew that I had this fascination with the classic movie monsters, and Aurora Model Kit Company came out with these wonderful little kits, and so he helped me build them when I was a kid. I had never really seen the classic movie monsters in color because all of them were black and white, and these boxes were so colorful. It gave me a new interest into them, that if I did make them life-size, I could light them like that, and they'd be, the color would be very exciting that way.
It was on summer vacations that fun attractions beckoned to families, and the Hull family was no different. As Cortlandt visited these attractions, he was most intrigued by the wax museums. He decided that he would create his own life-size characters and chose a witch, who to this day remains his trademark.
Oh yeah, I was a strange little kid.
Well, a lot of times families go on vacation and they'll visit the wax museum.
I was intrigued by the wax museums because initially I would see that they would have a billboard that such and such wax museum, visit our Chamber of Horrors. And I expected their Chamber of Horrors were going to be naturally the movie monsters. Sure. Well, it wasn't. It was torture devices, or Jack the Ripper, or some killer, Lee Harvey Oswald or something. And that's not what I expected to see, or guillotines or the rack. I wanted to see the Phantom of the Opera, or the Frankenstein monster, or the Hunchback of Notre Dame. And none of the wax museums had that at that time. And I thought, there should be some place you could go where you could see them life-size. And as much as I loved the little Aurora model kits, they're only 8 inches tall. You can't very well be frightened of something that's only 8 inches tall.
Someday, a young Cortlandt thought, he would open his first public attraction housing life-size characters. He wanted the name of this exhibit to reflect a character that was his own. Fascinated with arcade fortune tellers, he decided that a typical black-hatted witch wasn't what he wanted, but rather a gypsy witch. That is what he breathed life into, and so Zenobia was born.
She was the year before I started the Witch's Dungeon. I was only 12 when I made her, and I made her out of paper mache originally, and painted, of course, with real hair on her. And she was named after an old classmate of my mom's, that she says she was not the most popular girl. She was a witch. And she says, she always thought the name Zenobia would be a great name for a witch, and that's how the name came about.
At 13, with the help of his father Robert, Cortlandt decided to build a structure to house his creations. The Swiss chalet-styled building brought to mind a witch house to be found in an enchanted forest.
Well, that was the intention, to make it, Swiss chalet sort of gives you the feeling of a gingerbread house, like the witch, and since it was named after Zenobia, the witch's dungeon, that was why we decided to build it in that fashion.
So you continued to sculpt replicas of movie characters that would be added to the witch's dungeon. And how did you learn to sculpt, and what materials did you use?
Well, in the earliest days, since my sculpting techniques were left a little to be desired, don't forget I was only 13,
right.
I got the opportunity to meet Don Post Sr., and he had made these amazing masks, which of all the classic movie monsters, and he had contacts with Universal Studios as well. So we went out to California, and my mom and dad brought me out there because they thought we ought to take them out there to experience this. And so Don Post Sr. and Vern Langdon, who worked with him, the two of them took us through the entire process as to how they cast the heads, how they painted them, how they haired them. So we got firsthand tour that nobody else did as to how this was all done. And I have to thank actually Forrest J. Ackerman for introducing me to Don Post Sr. because he created this magazine along with James Warren called Famous Monsters of Filmland. And that's the magazine that kind of became the glue for all us little monster kids of the 1960s, because it made us feel there were others, that we weren't the only weird kids around, because we would write into the magazine and our letters would be published. And so this was something that was a great thing for kids in the 1960s.
As with any project that takes on its own momentum, Cortlandt was privileged with help along the way. Collaborators that saw his raw talent, dedication to learning, and bright intellect were pleased with the young artist and were eager to teach and share.
And I was, don't forget, I was extremely fortunate, the people that I met that helped me along the way to begin with, because like for instance, after Don Post, he eventually introduced me to John Chambers, and John had won Emmys as well as an Oscar for Planet of the Apes, which we have several of the Planet of the Apes heads behind us here. And he just kind of took me under his wing, and one day out of 20th Century Fox, he told my folks, why don't you go do some touristy things? And he says, I'll show Cortlandt how to make apes. And so he took me through the entire process, and he says, well, it's time for us to have lunch. And after we had lunch, he says, before I take you back and we continue, he says, why don't we go on some sets? So surprisingly, he took me on the sets of Lost in Space, Batman, Voyage at the Bottom of the Sea, and they were shooting an episode of Land of the Giants. And it was so funny because they had this huge hydraulic hand that was hitting Gary Conway back and forth. They did it like 5 or 6 times until they finally got the shot they wanted. And Conway comes over, he introduces me to him, and Gary Conway says, well, kid, that's what acting's all about.
An only child of Robert and Dorothea Hull, Cortlandt was born with talent in the blood. His father was a painting and decorating contractor who was also a wonderful builder. Dorothea did professional wardrobe design and was a talented artist in many mediums. Not to mention a great Aunt Josephine and Uncle Henry, who were Hollywood actors. Hull spent his years growing and learning with tremendous support and encouragement from his family.
My mom had done work on Broadway and also for other theatrical productions. So she was really amazing in her costume design work. As a matter of fact, one time when we went out to Universal years later with our friend John Chambers, he brought my mom around to the costume designer at Universal, and he was looking all over one of the costumes my mom made, and he says, if you ever want a job here, you're in. So they would have used her at Universal if she wanted to move out to California. Uncle Louis was the electrician.
Okay.
My dad was carpenter, but he also was a painting and decorating contractor. And then I had my mom and my grandmother that could do costume design. So as a kid, I had my own crew.
Truly, in the blood, Hull's inner monster has Hollywood ties which he can't resist making light of, as we can see here in this early childhood photo of he and his mother, with a few added neck bolts for a gag.
Yes, I was a little monster to begin with. I had my electrodes. I grew out of my electrodes.
But you had an uncle, a great uncle Henry Hull, and a great aunt Josephine. Tell us about their Hollywood.
Well, Henry Hull was really the first movie werewolf in 1935. He was the Werewolf of London. And that was co-starred with Warner Roland, who was better known as Charlie Chan. So he was originally, the makeup that was designed for it was all hair, like Lon Chaney eventually was in The Wolfman. The only reason he objected to it wasn't for vanity purposes, because he was an amazing makeup artist in his own right on the stage, because he did all his own makeup on the stage. But once he turned to film, they had a makeup artist union, so he couldn't do his own makeup. Nevertheless, the script, the way it was written, two of the characters were supposed to recognize him when he was the werewolf as being Dr. Glendon, or, you know, himself. And that's why he objected to the makeup, and he had some ideas as to how it could be changed but still be impressive. And it was his idea to have the widow's peak to give it a demonic look, and they toned down the makeup otherwise, so it was more of a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde type transformation.
And your great aunt Josephine.
Well, her last name was Sherwood, her maiden name, and she married Uncle Henry's brother, Shelley Hull, and so that's why she became a Hull by marriage. She was an actress to begin with, but then she gave up acting when she got married. Sadly, Shelley died rather young. He was in his 40s when he died. And she thought she'd turn back to doing acting because of the loss of her husband. So she was at least in her 40s when she went back to acting. And by the time she hit 50, she was on Broadway stage with Boris Karloff, starring in Arsenic and Old Lace, which was a phenomenal hit. It ran on Broadway for over 4 years. And during that time, Warner Brothers wanted to make it into a film. Unfortunately, the producers wouldn't allow Boris Karloff out of the Broadway contract because they were afraid it'd stop the run on Broadway, because he was their big star. But they allowed Josephine and Jean Adair, who played the two little old ladies that were poisoning people with elderberry wine, to go and do the film. And so, unfortunately, Boris couldn't. So he was replaced by Raymond Massey, who actually did a wonderful job, and they had Peter Lorre play the doctor in it. So it was a lot of fun, and it's really a timeless comedy. It really works every bit as well today as it did then.
So she was an accomplished actress.
Yes, and a funny little story that I did get a chance to meet Cary Grant years ago, and I asked him about it, and he said he loved working with Josephine because she was so bubbly and bouncy. That's how he described her. And he said she was so cute that he says, in one scene, I just gave her a little pat in the behind, and she stayed in character, and she says, "Now, Mortimer, you behave." And the director, Frank Capra, loved it so much, it's still in the picture. He kept it in the picture.
In the early 1960s, there were no Halloween attractions, and the young Hull wasn't sure how well his displays would be received. In 1966, the doors were opened, and the public was invited to visit the museum, which began to open many other doors that have continued to open for the last 50 years.
Let's go back to 1966 and what Halloween was like in 1966. You have to realize it was not what it is today. Today, Halloween is the second most popular holiday other than Christmas. Back then, it was celebrated one night, Halloween night, that was it. And it was just bobbing for apples, maybe a costume party, and trick-or-treating. That was it. And at that time, there were no Halloween attractions, none whatsoever. This was totally unique. What's commonly called Halloween attractions did not come about until the late 1970s, around 76, 77. And even Disney's Haunted Mansion didn't appear until 1969. The Witch's Dungeon was even several years before the Haunted Mansion. Mm-hmm. But the format, I think, is what made it unique, was because it was about the movies. It was not about slasher films. Of course, they didn't have slasher films right at that time. That's what it's become now. It wasn't just generic. It was specifically a tribute to the makeup artists and the actors that made these classic horror films. Now, to get back to your question, yes, originally the building was half the size. So it was a smaller building because we had no idea this was going to be popular. It was just my crazy idea, and my folks went along with it. So there were only 5 figures to begin with. Zenobia the Gypsy Witch, the Phantom of the Opera, Frankenstein, the Wolfman, and I think Mr. Hyde. That, I think, was the first group. And then after 2 years, well, it started to catch on. It was featured in different newspapers. Eventually it was picked up by the second year by the Associated Press, believe it or not. People were waiting around the block because they'd never seen anything like this before. And nobody ever saw me because I was upstairs running the controls. There was a second little crawl space upstairs, and that's where my Uncle Louis had put all the control panels and everything for the lighting and the sound. And as it worked off of a soundtrack that I had created with my uncle, and so I had to keep switching lights and audio
as people
on
progressed.
Switches as they progressed.
The tiny museum continued to grow and started to attract national attention due to articles in the New York Times, National Geographic, Ripley's Believe It or Not, and even Playboy. Network TV shows to tell the truth, Kids Are People Too, Entertainment Tonight, and Good Morning America featured the museum. Let's trip back to the 1970s for a quick snip of the actual footage of Hull's appearance on the national TV show To Tell the Truth, which at the time was hosted by Gary Moore.
Beneath the mask, a nice-looking man.
Connections to movie stars such as Vincent Price, John Agar, and Mark Hamill began to develop. They believed in the work that Hull was doing and saw the talent and artistry Hull had developed. Some even provided special recordings for the museum tour, which was a real treat for visitors, who then understood that some of the biggest names in Hollywood supported the museum.
Well, with Vincent Price, it was because my great-uncle Henry Hull had appeared in a movie called Master of the World with Vincent. And so that's how I got to meet Vincent. Also, we had a mutual friend that was a script continuity person on one of his pictures. So between the two of them, that's how I got to meet Vincent. And we remained friends right up until he passed away. And not only that, but Vincent also had me make some special note cards for me, had me do an illustration for him. And he found the original suit, the formal suit that he wore in House of Wax, and sent it to me, which we actually have on our figure of Vincent as Professor Jared from House of Wax.
Through the friendship between Hull and Price, recordings were done for the museum. Part of the charm of Vincent Price was his sense of humor, and in this recording, we'll hear that humor as we imagine what it might have been like to work with the actor.
Okay, this is take one.
Welcome, poor mortal, to this witch's dungeon of nightmares. As you journey through these dark corridors, you will encounter all those ghoulies, ghosties, and long-legged beasties that go bump in the night. That's no good. I better do another one.
June Foray, an American voice actress with a star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, was best known for the voice of Rocky the Flying Squirrel, Lucifer from Disney's Cinderella, and Cindy Lou Who from The Grinch. But it was her work as Granny from the Warner Brothers cartoons and her connection to Cortlandt that gave Zenobia her voice.
Well, first of all, I happen to know another voice actress, that was Mae Questel. And Mae was best known as the voice of Betty Boop and also Olive Oyl in the Popeye cartoons. Well, I knew she had done a character called the Sea Hag in the Popeye cartoons. And I asked her first if she would do the voice of my Zenobia, because up to that time I was using clips from some other cartoons that I had spliced together for Zenobia, and I wasn't happy with it because I wanted a special recording just for her because she was my own creation. And Mae thought it was a great idea, but she says, oh, I don't do that good a witch. You need June Foray. She does a great witch because she did Witch Hazel in the Bugs Bunny cartoons and also the Donald Duck cartoons. So immediately she calls up June while I'm there in New York with her at her apartment. And June gets on the phone and I explain to her, and we've become friends ever since.
So Zenobia found her voice.
Mm-hmm.
But there were some other friends you've met along the way, Mark Hamill for one. He did some work for you also.
Yes, Mark does a voice track that you hear while you're waiting in line to come in. And Mark has become a great, great friend over the years.
Work with many others came about, and Dick Smith was the mainstay in Hull's evolution. Known for his work on such films as Little Big Man, The Godfather, The Exorcist, Taxi Driver, and Scanners, Smith won a 1985 Academy Award for Best Makeup and Hairstyling for his work on Amadeus, and he received an Academy Honorary Award for his career's work. The chance to work with such movie greats was a thrill for Hull and a chance for icons like Smith to develop Hull's talent.
Very sweet people, and I have to say the 50th anniversary of the Witch's Dungeon is kind of bittersweet because they're no longer with us, and especially John Chambers, because he was one of the first major makeup artists that really taught me what I know about sculpting, about painting. I was very fortunate because who would have thought these wonderful, talented people would take an interest in a crazy kid that wanted to do a monster museum, you know.
But that crazy kid embraced the relationships, and relationships don't last a lifetime, Cortlandt, without you know, something on either end. So there was so much in you that they saw, and we're going to talk more about that. I actually heard that Dick Smith had told you in later years that he had been rough on you.
Well,
and that he felt bad that he had been rough on you.
it was that he also did have a school for teaching makeup besides, but we had a personal friendship because he originally lived in Larchmont, New York, which was not too far from me, and then eventually moved to Connecticut in his later years. Well, Dick would say to me, this is good, but it can be better. And this is the way you learn. It's because of the fact that someone like Dick, with the knowledge and the background that he had, his critiques would be, you'd learn from it. It's not like somebody saying, oh, that looks terrible. No, as I say, he would say it's good, but it can be better. And he always expected a little bit more from me. So more recently, not long before he passed away, he said that he was kind of hard on me. And I said, why? Because it didn't seem to me he was. And he says, well, there were some students that I had that I knew that was about the level they were going to be, and they wouldn't get that much higher. But he says, you were always willing to learn, and you always wanted to do more. And he says, that's the way I've been. He says, I never feel that I'm at the peak. You can always rise above that even further. And so that's why he said I was kind of hard on you, because he said I knew that you could do even better.
Mm-hmm. And so he pushed you.
And that's how you learn.
Because of the generosity of the talented artists and connections Cortlandt was making and his relationship to them, he acquired life casts of the actors to continue his work.
This is a life cast of Lon Chaney Jr. These are in plaster, that's why it's a little heavy. And this is lawn about the time when he did do The Wolfman. So this was around the early 1940s when this was taken. And the reason for this is that the makeup artists would do preliminary makeups on this to get an idea of how they wanted to configure the face. Like if with Chaney, of course, it'd be a nose and upper lip, and with some of the other ones, like with Boris Karloff, it would be the whole headpiece and so forth. So you take the actor's face and then you alter it with whatever character he's going to be. Well, in a similar way, by working with a live cast to begin with, when you're making a recreated figure of that actor, you want it to be the actor underneath the makeup, or else it doesn't look like them. And having a live cast gives you the dimensions of their face, even though you have to make alterations. Like, as you notice, his eyes are closed. And that's the way a live cast is taken. Well, except with Dick Smith, but that's a rarity. When he did The Exorcist, poor Linda Blair wore special contact lenses, and he did the live cast with her eyes open. But that's a unique process to do that. And also, you notice that it's only about just before the ear. Yeah. So therefore, you have to sculpt the rest of the head besides. But the biggest thing is the eyes, because so much of your expression comes from the eyes. The toughest thing was when I did Bela Lugosi, because Bela's eyes, so much of the character of Dracula comes from this squint that he has when he's about to go after his victim. And if you don't get it just right, it doesn't look like him. So that was one of the toughest things. I did 5 different sculpts of him as Dracula before I was happy with one.
So it is true that it's all in the eyes.
It is, yeah, and especially with someone like Bela, that is where so much of the character comes from. But even in a way, Boris as the Frankenstein monster, the droopy eyelids, there's a certain expression that comes there. And of course, I always use glass eyes in the characters and human hair.
Human hair.
So they look real.
As Hull's university studies and artistic abilities were broadening his horizons, he met other famous people and developed ongoing friendships with many. Margaret Hamilton, well known for her portrayal of the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz, was one of these.
Well, I was very fortunate again. I was a student at the University of Hartford Art School, and I got a chance to do a commission with Maxwell House. They were planning to sponsor The Wizard of Oz one year, and they wanted a unique poster that could be, that you would put in a proof of purchase and $1, and you'd get this poster. So I came up with this idea of having Margaret Hamilton as the Wicked Witch of the West with her flying monkey looking into the crystal ball, and instead of seeing Dorothy and the other characters, she was seeing a can of Maxwell House coffee. See?
Good to the last drop.
Yes. And so they loved the idea, and unfortunately, there was some mix-up that they didn't clear it with MGM first that owned the movie, and it was never produced. But as sort of a consolation prize, I got to spend an entire afternoon with Margaret Hamilton. I gave her because I had to do several of these in different color combinations. So I gave her an original one of what I did of her as the Wicked Witch, which she loved.
What was she like?
Such a sweet lady, and so much smaller than you think. You think of her being huge because of the hat, and as she said, they had higher heels and lifts on her to bring her up to be more impressive.
As time moved on, Cortlandt continued making new friendships, and some in the most unlikely ways. It's as if the Witch's Dungeon continues to have a life of its own, attracting the right people to the museum at the right time.
Well, Audrey has become our new costume designer. My mom passed away in 2004, and by chance we met when I had a display up at the Big E in Springfield, and she saw this beautiful costume my mom made of the Red Death, Mask of the Red Death from Phantom of the Opera, and she was intrigued by it. And I don't know, we started talking and I said, you know, I've always wanted to do the Beast from the French Jean Cocteau film La Belle et la Bête with Jean Marais that played the part. And she says, I love that film. What were the chances? I mean, it's a kind of an obscure film, especially this was almost 6, 7 years ago when we met. And I said, boy, I would love to recreate that character. And she says, well, let's do it. She says, I'm retired. And she says, as long as you don't pressure me that I have to do it too fast, because she says, this is going to be intricate, it'll take time. So the two of us worked together, and I picked out the materials for it. We had to get edgings and lace from France, from Italy. We had to special order it because it's not something you could find around here. Especially some of the edgings had jewels and everything that are on it. And then all the gloves are all hand sewn, and it's got all these designs on the gauntlets of the gloves. You know, it's just amazing work that she did. So it's become my favorite figure since she made this with me.
The former Bristol High School was built in 1890. The trademarks of the building include the use of stone and semicircular arches, which demonstrate the Romanesque influence. It was used as a school until 1922 and most recently renovated as the home for the Bristol Historical Society. When the Witch's Dungeon outgrew its space, the one-of-a-kind movie props could no longer be safely displayed. The Historical Society and Hull collaborated to continue the Bristol tradition in the much larger venue, and Hull's museum exhibits were gladly welcomed in 2014. Since its move, people have visited the museum from 23 different countries, 40 states, and roughly 3/4 of Connecticut communities. Cortlandt has another family, that of his friends and peers in the entertainment industry. One special friend is Bill Diamond. Diamond began his career as a child actor on Broadway and TV commercials, went on to work on Sesame Street under Jim Henson, the legendary Muppet creator, and in 1976 created his production company, Bill Diamond Productions, producing and directing multiple TV series in the 80s and 90s. Diamond is a 2-time Emmy Award winner for his work as a lighting director.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think we work well. I mean, he's masterful at what he wants to accomplish. He knows what he wants to do. He just doesn't know how to get there sometimes. So I try to help him get there, but he's pretty much got a really good, clear picture of where he wants to be and what he wants to do. I knew Sara Karloff as well as Cortlandt did, and the different families. And Cortlandt and I kind of grew up being around Foray Ackerman. So, you know, our interest was always the monsters and special effects in the film. And that's what makes The Witch's Dungeon so successful, is that it celebrates that. So because of that, I wanted to find a way where I can pull in what I was doing with the characters and then keep the, you know, actors and the effects alive. And through Monster TV, I was able to, you know, build Uncle Henry and Boris Karloff and build them as puppet characters, which Sara was thrilled at because it was like a new level. The only other time it was ever done was with Rankin Smith for Mad Monster. It was never ever done in puppetry outside of that kind of puppetry. So that, you know, other ones, even Jim did monster puppets, furry creatures, but never of the actors. And so I wanted to create that world and then put real people in it where if we had like Rick Baker or Dick Smith or Cortlandt or any of them on, or Zachary like we did, they would interact and it would be fun for them. It's almost like a monster Muppet Show type of thing.
Yeah, it's hard to be a werewolf in London. It's hard to be a werewolf in the baggage claim department.
I see.
In the old dungeon, he had a nice little showcase of how they were used, which made it very quaint. Well, then you wind up moving here in the Historical Society, and now you need a bigger backgrounds. Well, at the studios, we had many backgrounds that are used, and these backgrounds are used in television or on stage productions, so they're just as well known but not seen as the figures are. So They weren't just built for the dungeon, they've been reincorporated for the dungeon. So the backgrounds may have been in a TV show, may have been on a Broadway play, may have been whatever, and I've kind of taken those elements that fit that character and display them, and now make it part of that scene. And then when you light it, you want it to be like the old films where it's kind of shadow. It has a lot of color. Now, what's interesting is here what Cortlandt did was the characters are in color, which in the movies they were in black and white.
With the lift of an eyebrow, the same as her father's, Mary Victoria is the warm and welcoming public speaker and author who enjoys sharing the special nuances of her father, acting legend Vincent Price. A university professor and interior designer, she has appeared on HGTV and in many design publications. She travels internationally to give talks on the life of her father. Hull's special relationship with her dad is one that Victoria takes pride in. Her friendship with Cortlandt continues and allows her to make museum appearances and support the showcase of the work of her father.
I met Cortlandt in 1999 in Virginia at something called Monster Rally, which was my first horror convention. And it was the first time I met any of the other people that I've come to know so well, Sara Karloff and Bela Lugosi Jr. and Ron Chaney and a lot of the horror fans. And I met Cortlandt, and it was a really fun weekend because it was the first time that I really understood that there was a whole community of people who not only loved this genre but loved my dad. And Cortlandt and my dad had such a wonderful relationship, and so getting to meet Cortlandt and hear a little bit about that relationship and how they had connected and how my dad had supported his work was really wonderful for me. I didn't think my dad was treated differently because he was famous. I thought he was treated differently because he was different. He was just different than any other adult I've ever met. I like to say that it was almost as if when he walked in a room, the roof blew off and the sky came shining through and the sun came shining through. He had such a profound impact on people and such a powerful light. And he used that light to encourage other people to shine their own lights. And so I think my dad was just different than other people. I've had the great privilege of knowing so many extraordinary people in my life, people who have done amazing things. But I still think my dad is probably the most interesting person I've ever met because he moved through the world with this really fascinating combination of curiosity and generosity. And that's a wonderful thing. When I was in my 20s, Roddy McDowall said to me, "You have to keep paying attention and you have to keep listening because you grew up in Hollywood, but most people in Hollywood don't know that Hollywood has a history. And if you, who've been surrounded by all this history and have gotten to hear so many stories, don't listen, then you're making a huge mistake." My dad had a wicked, wicked sense of humor. And I felt him just now. And I think what he would have said was something with his arched eyebrow, which I can do. It's the same arched eyebrow. I just want to point that out. That he wishes Cortlandt another wonderful 50 years doing this. And I think he would have had something very witty to say about the sepulchral Cortlandt at, 100 and whatever that would make him, tottering through the halls. But you know what? I don't put it past Cortlandt. So I wish Cortlandt, very seriously, another wonderful 50 years doing this.
Friends and supporters also include family members of the iconic movie actors. Sara Karloff, the colorful, witty, funny, and oh-so-charming daughter of actor icon Boris Karloff. Cortlandt has been friends with Sara most of his life, and they share a special bond. Though we know Boris as an actor who did film, television, radio, and theater, a daughter's view and subsequent relationship with Hull is a rare treat.
I've known Cortlandt since he was knee-high to a grasshopper. He was much younger than he is today. He's very old now. since we are celebrating the 50th anniversary of this. I didn't know him 50 years ago, or I'd have to admit to my own age, but I have known him since 1994. But I knew him before that. I met him first with my 2 children when I took my 2 sons to visit Foray, and that's the first time I met Cortlandt. I've been coming to the Witch's Dungeon. We were talking about it over dinner, Cortlandt and I, and I think it's been since 1994, and it is so remarkable, the job that Cortlandt has done, and to find a home for it like this wonderful historical society housing for it is just, it's like it's found the proper home. And each and every display is done so meticulously as only Cortlandt could do. Each figure is so beautifully done. And the new edition of Artist Bay is magnificent. The costumes have always been superb, and this costume is no exception. But the lighting, the choice of figures, the manner in which the figures are displayed, everything is sheer perfection and such a tribute to the whole classic genre of film, to the actors themselves, to the roles they portrayed, and to their contribution individually and collectively to cinema history and a particular genre of film. We as families can never thank Cortlandt enough, and of course, we're thrilled to see it in its new home. My dad starred on Broadway in 5 different plays, one of which was The Lark, in which he played opposite Julie Harris, and they adored each other. It was one of the highlights of my father's career, playing with Julie. They were each nominated for a Tony, and Julie won hers, my dad didn't, but it was a lifetime highlight for my father. He also played in Arsenic and Old Lace on Broadway, in a role that he had a lot of lines, but there was one line he delivered every night that brought the house down. So it was great fun for him to play in Arsenic. And my dad loved working with children. He did 20-some albums that were children's fairy tales and Rudyard Kipling, and he loved doing that. So he loved working with kids as well as for kids. And so he was in Peter Pan on Broadway, and he played Captain Hook and Mr. Darling. And he arranged for me to come and visit him while he was in Peter Pan. And he arranged for me to see it from the wings and backstage and out front. And at the end of my week-long visit, he said, "Well, I can see you don't have the fire in the belly for being an actress, because you paid more attention to Nana the dog than you did to me." I think my favorite film that my father made is one he did later in life, and that's Targets. He did that with Peter Bogdanovich, and in it he plays an aging horror film star, brilliant casting. And he really enjoyed working with Peter, and he's playing himself. And so much of my father's own gentle, caring nature came through in that role. And it spoke to my father's own philosophy, which is that the real horror is on the streets and not up on the screen. He had a lot of personal wisdom. He was a great listener, had a lovely sense of humor. He had a way of surreptitiously delivering lessons. He and I used to play gin rummy, and he certainly never let me win. If I won, I won. But the lesson was to also learn to accept the times you didn't win. And that really was the lessons of the game. My father was a very modest man, very self-effacing in his humor, and really very, very modest. Never brought his work home, never talked about his work. But one night, he called me, and my two sons were quite little guys at that point. And he said, I've done a bit of work, piece of work, and I think it's pretty special. I think it's pretty good, and I think the boys would enjoy it. And it's going to appear tonight on television. And maybe you could sit down with the boys and watch it. I think you all might enjoy it. And that was so out of character for my father to do that. And so, of course, we did. And it was How the Grinch Stole Christmas, for which he won a Grammy. But it's such a special part of the legacy he left. And it makes his legacy multi-generational. And it's just a part of everybody's Christmas, as he is part of everybody's Halloween. But the Grinch is just a wonderful part of everybody's heart. And he won a Grammy for it. And he was in England during the ceremony, and his agent at the time called him and said, Boris, you've been nominated for a Grammy. And he said, oh, Arthur, would you go to the ceremony for me? My father was not into awards at all. So the next time my father came over from England to the West Coast, he went to see his agent, and Arthur said, here, Boris, here's your Grammy. And my father took it, and he looked at it, and he said, it looks like a bloody doorstop. And he took it, and he put it over on his agent's door floor, and left it. One of the things my father was very proud of, but very quietly proud of, was his work as a founding member of the Screen Actors Guild. And his card number is number 9. And my mother told me that they used to park their cars blocks away from one another's houses to have meetings, and then walk to whoever home the meeting was at that particular night. Or they would go to parties, the couples would go to parties, and then they would dance by one another on the dance floor and whisper, meeting Tuesday night at so-and-so's house, and dance right on by. Because it really was a dangerous business, forming a union of actors against the all-powerful studios. And there were 12 founding members. And each one had struggled and had been maltreated, if you like, by the studios and the hours they had to work, or in my father's case, not only the hours, but the makeup. And my father lost 25 pounds during the making of Frankenstein. And they were, the actors were nothing but a piece of meat to the studios at that point. And you look at where SAG is today, and the ginormous building it has in Hollywood, and how important a role it is played in helping actors. And at that point, these founding members felt that once they had reached a point in their own careers where they had a voice, they needed to give back to their profession and provide a manner in which to give a voice to the up-and-coming actors. That really was so important to my father. And he adored his profession. He worked up until the day he died. But a little-known fact is that my father made probably close to 170 films. But Frankenstein was his 81st film. He'd been around 20 years, and nobody had seen the first 80 films. So those that were coming up in the business needed the voice that SAG gave them. That was my father. Congratulations, and as my father would say, full marks, and thank you for the homage you pay all of these wonderful actors and their roles with this magnificent, magnificent Witch's Dungeon. Thank you, Courtney.
We've enjoyed bringing you this episode, but before we go, this story would not be complete without giving you a sneak peek inside the exhibit. So enjoy the artistry, magic, and emotion that is the Witch's Dungeon.
Come closer to the cauldron, dearie. Old Zenobia's brewing a delectable concoction. Oh, how delicious. Hurry now, drink every drop. The blossom of youth is yours forever, with a beauty sleep of centuries to come.
I see you have survived this maze of monsters and nightmares. Or have you? And so until we meet again, good night and pleasant dreams.